The Bogosity Podcast, early and ad-free. Become a subscriber at Patreon, Subscribestar, or Discord. Use the links at donate.bogosity.tv.
Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of February 16, 2025, the podcast that's returnable for deposit. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's mortify the news of the bogus. There are a couple of big AI stories this week, the first one being the first ever copyright awarded to an image made solely with generated AI components. I have a separate video about that, so I won't cover it here. Check my channel on YouTube, Odyssey, or Rumble. The other story is about the abuse of the technology. We've covered before the issues with AI fakes of real people, such as when students use AI to make simulated nude images of their classmates. But this one has an interesting wrinkle. The student never actually shared the images. To add another wrinkle, the student did all of this at home and not in the school's jurisdiction. So this isn't just about AI, it's about the reach of the school's disciplinary jurisdiction. A school district in New York had received complaints that, quote, male students had used an artificial intelligence application to create nude images of several female classmates and shared them with other students. They suspended a 9th grade student who admitted that he created 3 images but denied showing them to or sharing them with anyone else. He also deleted the images. However, he also told other people about the website he used to generate them. They suspended him on the basis of 1. Contributing to the disruption of the educational environment at the high school, and 2. Creating and/or distributing artificially generated pornographic images which convincingly resembled multiple female students, resulting in harassment, bullying, and the creation of a hostile environment for said female students. Notice the and/or there. The idea is that they can go after students who distribute the images even if they didn't create them. But by the text itself, it goes the other way. They can be used against a student who created them but never shared them, even though that's clearly not the intent. New York Commissioner of Education Betty Rosa concluded that this was an improper termination and expunged the suspension from the student's record. The issue is they can only police conduct outside of school, quote, if such conduct endangered the health or safety of pupils within the educational system or adversely affected the educational process. But Rosa found they failed to do so, quote, the student created the images at home and deleted them thereafter. There is no evidence that the student distributed the images or intended for their distribution. Indeed, respondent only learned of the student's conduct through its investigation of other students who had, in fact, distributed such images. I share respondent's concern that AI fake nudes have become a massive problem for the well-being of students across the country. However, that does not mean that students may be suspended based merely on their proximity to such conduct. Respondent was required to prove the foreseeability that 3 images created at home and since deleted would come to the attention of school authorities, which it did not. As for merely informing other students about the existence of the website, quote, to the extent the district also charged the student with conduct resulting in harassment, bullying, and the creation of a hostile environment for said female students, charges defined solely by consequences cannot serve as a basis for suspension. In other words, he wasn't doing anything wrong per se by telling the other students about the website. If the other students then use the website for bad purposes, that's on them. The student they suspended isn't responsible for the consequences of actions taken by other students. When we talk about rights as applying to people, they apply to children as well. Maybe even more so, since they have limited self-determination under the law and are more vulnerable to authoritarian overreach. And nowadays, any moderately powerful computer can do AI deepfakes. That cat is already out of the bag. The old ways of approaching harassment and discipline just aren't going to work. we need to train both teachers and students in how to think about these issues in the new world generative AI is creating. It's not really any different than the introduction of the internet. That was an incredibly disruptive innovation that changed how we view things, especially regarding things like chat rooms and selfies. It's understandable that it took a while to adjust to the new norm back then, but come on, we've already been through this once. We can shift our thinking again. And we'd better get used to it, because who knows what new disruptive technology we're going to be talking about 10 or 20 years down the road.
Sometimes you just have to stomp some skulls. From the mind of Mr. Dapperton, a game for the ages. In a world where a race of undead furries tries to take over the world's nuclear arsenal, one man must stop them. But which man? You choose. The Orange Overlord.
Ow, my ear!
Bernie Slanders. Debate Dominator.
My kip was ruined.
Or Joe Sleepy.
Build me back.
And of course, Mr. Fancy Pants himself.
Forget those losers! You can get the Gold Edition and play as 4 more characters, including me, the Spooky Spaceman, along with Billionaire Brat, Professor Proof, and the easiest way to play, as Jesus himself!
7 complete different worlds, with more coming all the time. Full controller support. You can even get eaten by a worm and pooped out into a furry cathedral.
And don't forget that Gold Edition, where you can play the ultimate challenge, Devil's Doorstep.
This gory satirical adventure pulls no punches. You know you want this game. Go to links.bogosity.tv/skullstompers and play Skull Stompers now.
And we have another good case confirming the difference between First Amendment protected press and a propaganda machine. We previously covered the Covington kids case where the courts found that CNN had no free press protections because they were the originators of the false information spread about those students. They went beyond mere reporting of false information. They acted with actual malice. Actual malice is a legal term that means that you knew or should have known that what you said was false, or you acted in reckless disregard for the truth. A lot of protections you might otherwise have against defamation claims, such as if you were lampooning a public figure, don't apply as soon as there's actual malice. In this case, it's Donald Trump suing the Pulitzer Board over their decision to award a prize to the New York Times and the Washington Post for regurgitating the propaganda regarding Russiagate. The Pulitzer Board repeated the lies themselves after Trump asked them to rescind the award. Quote, "No passages or headlines, contentions, or assertions in any of the winning submissions were discredited by facts that emerged subsequent to the conferral of the prizes. The 2018 Pulitzer Prizes in National Reporting stand." They must actually be insane! We covered all sorts of examples of exactly that. Sounds a bit like Horatio Nelson saying, "I see no ships," after holding the spyglass to his blind eye. They tried getting the case thrown out on First Amendment grounds, and they not only failed at the trial court level, they now failed on their appeal to the Fourth Circuit. Judge Jeffrey Kuntz wrote for the unanimous 3-judge panel, quote, "Trump's operative pleading sufficiently pled that the defendants engaged in a conspiracy to defame him. Further, the defendants issued the website public statement in response to the requests of a Florida resident, Trump. They did so in a meeting attended remotely by a Florida resident who also conducted an editing review of the proposed website statement while in Florida. Because Trump met the personal jurisdiction requirements of Florida's long-arm statute and the Due Process Clause, the circuit court's order is affirmed." Ed Artow, joined by the other judge in the panel, Burton C. Connor, wrote in a concurrence, "The statement described an actual or alleged event or circumstance with the board members vouching for the truth of facts that had been debunked after thorough investigation, thereby rendering it a statement of fact. To the extent any part of the statement could be considered opinion in form or context, the statement was nonetheless actionable as a mixed opinion with implied facts. And that means they can't use the Rachel Maddow defense of worming your way around defamation by saying, it's just an opinion. Quote, despite the fact that the awarded organizations had reported the individual components of the Russia collusion hoax, which were exposed as utter fiction, the Pulitzer board members vouched for the truth of reporting that had been debunked by all credible sources charged with investigating the false claim. He references New York Times v. Sullivan, the case where the actual malice standard comes from. And then he made an interesting statement, quote, the actual malice standard, which the president sufficiently pled here, must apply. However, inferior courts can suggest, as I do here, that the Supreme Court revisit whether New York Times v. Sullivan should continue to be the law of the land, despite historical evidence showing it does not comport with the original understanding of the First Amendment. This is part of a growing opposition among judges to the standard who are frustrated by how inconsistently it's been applied, as well as the chilling effect it has on people who have been truly harmed seeking redress for defamation. The burden of proof has just become too high. It's a standard that basically gives media defendants privileges over individual plaintiffs, which isn't at all what the original intent of the First Amendment was supposed to do. Nonetheless, in this case at least, actual malice is obvious. Quote, the president has met his burden of establishing jurisdiction to proceed with his asserted claims that the non-resident defendants acted with actual malice or reckless disregard for the truth by knowingly conspiring with the Florida resident defendant to defame the president by publishing the statement with the ultimate purpose of resurrecting the debunked Russia collusion hoax when, at the time the statement was issued, it was abundantly clear to anyone interested in the truth that the Russia collusion hoax was utter fiction and had been contrived and concocted by malicious partisans. Therefore, the trial court correctly denied the non-resident defendant's motion to dismiss the president claims over the asserted publication of defamatory fake news. Whatever the reason, the news media has become far too brazen in their lies and defamation, with extreme political biases affecting everyone from elected officials to teenagers on a field trip. Something has to change. At the very least, there needs to be more cases like this and more judges like these. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.bogosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.bogosity.tv. So we've talked about the opioid crisis and how the CDC lied and faked data showing that addiction and overdoses were caused by prescription opioids when it was really black market opioids that were causing the problem. We also showed how the crackdown on prescription opioids resulted in overdoses increasing, first with black market heroin and later with fentanyl, which is hundreds of times stronger than heroin. We've also talked briefly about carfentanil, an especially strong version of fentanyl that is thousands of times as potent as heroin. I mean, it makes sense when you realize it's made as an anesthetic for elephants. So, learning no lessons at all, they've been trying to make a dent in fentanyl overdoses by giving addicts naloxone, which can counter the effects of opioids. Unless, like carfentanil, it's so strong it completely overpowers it. Pharmaceutical researcher Josh Bloom, who wrote the article linked in the show notes, along with Dr. Jeff Singer, came up with the Iron Law of Prohibition. As enforcement of drug prohibition increases, the potency of prohibited substances tends to increase. Amid all the crackdowns in China and on the Mexican border, we're seeing, as I predicted years ago, more homespun fentanyl, which is faster and cheaper to produce than heroin because you don't need a grow operation. You just create it in a lab. But the more makeshift labs they have here in the States produces fentanyl of a much poorer quality. But before you start celebrating, remember the Iron Law of Prohibition. They're making up for the less potent domestic fentanyl by adding carfentanil. Previously, it's been cut with xylazine, a veterinary sedative that isn't neutralized by naloxone. On the other hand, it isn't as deadly as fentanyl. But in the period from July to December of 2023 and January to June 2024, the number of overdose deaths with carfentanil detected increased 720%, practically overnight. Of course, we know the solution: end the war on drugs. But as Bloom said in a comment, quote, "Still too much potential extortion money for trial lawyers and the paid toadies who tell them what they want to hear. This has never been about public health, only money." The issue has to do with binding strength, which is basically how sticky a molecule is to a receptor. The higher the number, the more persistent it is. Morphine has a binding strength of just 1. Fentanyl has a binding strength of 100, but so does naloxone, so it's an effective antagonist. He doesn't give a figure for heroin because heroin is actually metabolized before it reaches the brain, turning into morphine. But carfentanil has a binding strength of 10,000, 2 orders of magnitude greater than naloxone. And if that's not bad enough, the half-life of carfentanil in the human body is about 6 hours, but it's just 1 hour for naloxone. So not only do you need far more naloxone to treat a carfentanil overdose, you need to keep giving it to the patient. That's tricky in a hospital setting, but doable. The problem is, most of the reduction in overdoses comes from civilian applications of naloxone. A layperson can use naloxone to stop an overdose of fentanyl in himself or others, but the problems of using it to treat a carfentanil overdose are now obvious. Bloom wrote in the comments, "Whether the half-life is 1 hour or 6 won't matter when naloxone is administered at a party or, even worse, on the street. The fact that multiple IV doses or an infusion of naloxone may save lives in an ICU is largely irrelevant. If carfentanil becomes widely used, people will be dropping dead left and right." And as Bloom points out in the article, the real lesson here should be about what else will emerge in the future. Quote, "It is impossible to predict when and where the next worst drug will emerge. The addition of carfentanil to fentanyl, should it become widespread, will become an instant, deadly problem. It's a truly evil drug, and it's unlikely that we are prepared to deal with it. The Iron Law continues to reign." He also mentioned that while opioid overdoses did decline, overdoses in meth and cocaine continue to increase. So overall, yeah, you're not solving the problem of overdoses. But go on, sue Walgreens a little harder. I'm sure that'll turn things around. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. And now it's time to aerobicize this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And we're basically going to give it to all of the Democrats and their cronies in the news media for the last 4 years for, as we repeatedly covered, trying to gaslight everyone by telling us the economy was doing great and we were just too stupid to notice. It's actually nice to see this headline in Politico of all places, although they had to phrase it as, quote, "Voters were right about the economy. The data was wrong." The data? No, you were wrong. And moreover, you were lying. But I guess in a case like that, you gotta do what Eugene Ludwig did in the article and make it seem like it was all an innocent mistake because they were just confoozled by all the mathiness. Quote, "Many Democrats were puzzled by the seeming disconnect between economic reality as reflected in various government statistics and the public's perceptions of the economy on the ground. Many in Washington bristled at the public's failure to register how strong the economy really was. They charged that right-wing echo chambers were conning voters into believing entirely preposterous narratives about America's decline. They were insisting on that because they knew it was false. If they thought they were right, they wouldn't have to resort to that. They would have looked at sound data, like we did." Quote, "What they rarely considered was whether something else might be responsible for the disconnect. Whether, for instance, government statistics were fundamentally flawed." Well, yeah, they are, but they're flawed on purpose. We saw how they manipulated the inflation figures, for example. Quote, "On some level, I relate to the underlying frustrations. Having served as comptroller of the currency during the 1990s, I've spent substantial chunks of my career exploring the gaps between public perception and economic reality, particularly in the realm of finance. And that," he said, quote, "has led me to be increasingly skeptical that the government's measurements properly capture the realities defining unemployment, wage growth, and the strength of the economy as a whole." Well, thanks for finally catching up with the rest of us. He talks about how the unemployment figures made it seem like everyone had jobs when traveling around the country showed him otherwise. So Ludwig got together a team of researchers to look into it. Quote, "What we uncovered shocked us. The bottom line is that for 20 years or more, including the months prior to the election, voter perception was more reflective of reality than the incumbent statistics." He explains what most of us have known, and I've explained more than once before. Unemployment figures only count people who are out of work but actively looking for work. It doesn't count people who are underemployed, working odd hours just to get by while they look for a full-time job, or workers who are so discouraged they quit looking entirely. It also doesn't count income or net worth levels. You could have basically nothing living on the streets, and as long as you've got enough of an intermittent income, you are still counted as employed. Quote, "I don't believe those who went into this past election taking pride in the unemployment numbers understood that the near record low unemployment figures, the figure was a mere 4.2% in November, counted homeless people doing occasional work as employed. But the implications are powerful. If you filter the statistic to include as unemployed people who can't find anything but part-time work or make a poverty wage, the percentage is actually 23.7%. In other words, nearly 1 of every 4 workers is functionally unemployed in America today. Hardly something to celebrate. Yeah, watch what they do now. They'll say, under Biden, unemployment was reported at only 4.2%, but now under Trump it's 23.7%. Because this is not an honest mistake. This is manipulation. Just like they're already doing with eggs, blaming the high prices on Trump when egg prices reflect conditions of some 2 months ago. The bird flu epidemic is actually the main driver, so that will need a resolution plus about 7 to 8 weeks for egg prices to get back to normal. Or we could just repeal the Agricultural Adjustment Act and overturn Wickard v. Filburn and allow small local farmers to sell to grocery stores, but I'm getting off track again. Same with income. Technically, the median income is $61,900, but if you include everyone in the workforce, including part-time workers and unemployed job seekers, it's some $10,000 less, 16% lower than reported. And inflation as well. Biden and all the Democrats and their AstroTurf brigade kept tweeting that prices were back down when anyone who did their own grocery shopping knew they weren't. The rate at which they were increasing went down, but that's a different thing entirely. But even the inflation figures are misleading. The Consumer Price Index tracks the prices of 80,000 goods and services across the economy. But as we've covered, it's kind of cherry-picked. Most people use most of their money to purchase groceries, healthcare, and rent. But that only figures into a tiny fraction of CPI. It's not weighted to how consumers actually spend the money. So if the price of eggs and studio apartment leases rise more than luxury goods and second homes, the price increases that people are actually facing are greater than what CPI would suggest. So Ludwig and his colleagues modeled the prices weighted by what people actually buy and found that since 2001, the cost of living for Americans with modest incomes increased 35% faster than CPI. Officially, in 2023, CPI increased by 4.1%, but the true cost of living that Ludwig and his team measured increased at more than twice that rate, 9.4%. And despite the rhetoric that wage increases outpaced inflation, they found that when you account for wage increases, purchasing power fell by 4.3% in 2023. These indicators and more give a misleading picture that low and middle income households are doing a lot better than they are, almost as if they were designed that way. Ludwig wrote, "This should not be a partisan issue. Policymakers in both parties would benefit from gleaning a more accurate sense of what's happening at the ground level of the American economy." Well, that's a naive view. That assumes they care that they're right, as opposed to caring only about what numbers they can use to snow the people into re-electing them and giving them more power and money. Still, it's nice to see the economic reality make it into at least one media outlet from one of the men partially involved in it, and it makes the reality of the situation pretty undeniable for anyone who wants to be at all reasonable. Which leaves out Democrats in the news media, making them all this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-aged children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at Bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now let's disproportionatenessify this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. So, as we all know from watching the news media, Elon Musk is taking over the reins of government to enrich himself and steal all of our data. Yeah, it's a laugh, but you don't need me to tell you that. This is all blatant projection, as that's exactly the goal of the entire progressive era. It wasn't some grassroots movement to protect workers and help the poor. It was to use those ideas as an excuse to seize more power for politicians and their cronies who could use it to stifle smaller competition and gain more market share for themselves. And man, everything they've gone to try and protect their grift. I mean, as a libertarian, I thought getting into power and getting rid of blatantly unconstitutional federal spending would be rough, but even I didn't expect the opposition to be this all-encompassing. I could probably give this to basically all of the news media again, but I'm going to focus on the New York Times because that's the one Michael Schellenberger singled out in his tweet with a very extensive article headlined, "Musk asserts without proof that bureaucracy is rife with fraud." Without proof? Seriously? Even the GAO under Biden estimated last year that we were losing $500 billion per year to fraud, and the real number is probably even higher. Now, of course, as people complicit in the grift, the Times stopped short of saying there wasn't any fraud, but they lied outright and said that Musk failed to provide any examples when he provided example after example after example. One of the more egregious examples is the limestone mine where federal retirement paperwork is stored. Hundreds of federal workers sit 230 feet underground, processing thousands of retirement applications every month as employees of the Office of Personnel Management. Hear it from Musk himself when he was talking about his idea of downsizing the government by just letting people retire.
We're told the most number of people that could retire possibly in a month is 10,000. We're like, well, why is that? Well, because all the retirement paperwork is manual on paper. It's manually calculated, then written down on a piece of paper. Then it goes down a mine. And like, what do you mean a mine? Like, yeah, there's a limestone mine where we store all the retirement paperwork. And then the speed, then the limiting factor is the speed at which the mine shaft elevator can move determines how many people can retire from the federal government. And the elevator breaks down sometimes, and then nobody can retire. Doesn't that sound crazy? There's like 1,000 people that work on this. So I think if we can take those people and say, like, you know what, instead of working in a mine shaft and carrying manila envelopes to, boxes in a mine shaft, you could do practically anything else, and you would add to the goods and services of the United States in a more useful way.
And there's fraud everywhere, including in Social Security.
And there's crazy things like just cursory examination of Social Security, and we've got people in there that are 150 years old. Now, do you know anyone who's 150? I don't. Okay. They should be on the Guinness Book of World Records. They're missing out.
And that was far from the only example.
We have a case in New York where a hotel has paid $59 million. $59 million because it's housing migrants, illegal migrants. All illegal, I believe.
And they were being paid twice the normal room rate at 100% occupancy.
Unbelievable.
So it's a racket.
And the Times is treating this as if it's an extraordinary claim, but it's just not. Government waste is well established and documented. Medicare fraud is something like $50 billion. COVID fraud is $135 billion. And the Pentagon has failed 7 audits in a row. And we've covered before how they've in the past been unable to account for billions of dollars in their budget. In fact, last year the Defense Department admitted that it lost $8.2 billion of Ukraine funds. 15% of the funds allocated to rebuild Iraq were misspent, and another 10% disappeared, and billions of federal funds have gone to the Taliban. And the kicker is, all of these have been extensively covered in the news media, including the New York Times. That's really the big question. Why is there so much insane, vociferous resistance to this?
We do find it sort of rather odd that, there are quite a few people in the bureaucracy who have ostensibly a salary of a few $100,000, but somehow manage to accrue tens of millions of dollars in net worth.
Oh, gee. Go figure. So all of that makes the New York Times this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this You Can Snap Me In and Snap Me Out edition of the Bogosity podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at the Discord or at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Milton Friedman. I say thank God for government waste. If government is doing bad things, it's only the waste that prevents the harm from being greater. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.